The shift in U.S. security policy not only has allies in Europe scrambling to increase their defense spending, it also raises uncomfortable questions about their dependency on American weapons already in their arsenal.
Germany's planned acquisition of 35 American F-35 fighter jets has come under scrutiny following concerns that the U.S. under President Donald Trump could disable the aircraft remotely.
Germany may refuse to purchase American F-35 jets over concerns that the U.S. under President Trump could disable the aircraft remotely with the kill switch.
You know something has gone seriously wrong when America spends decades building the world's most dominant military export machine, pressures its allies to spend more money on defense, and then watches that money start flowing somewhere else entirely, because that is exactly what is happening right now. European governments that once lined up automatically for American weapons are suddenly buying South Korean artillery, Swedish surveillance aircraft, and talking openly about reducing dependence on Washington, while the F-35 program that was supposed to lock allies into the American system for the next 30 years is turning into a bargaining chip in trade wars and political disputes. And the part that is making people in Washington nervous is that this shift is no longer theoretical because the contracts are already moving. Ever since returning to office, Trump has treated NATO less like a traditional alliance and more like a transaction where protection comes with conditions attached. He pushed NATO members to raise defense spending to 5% of GDP, a level far above what most European governments had planned for, while publicly questioning whether the United States would automatically defend allies that failed to meet expectations. During multiple speeches, he described parts of NATO as weak, dependent, and unwilling to carry their own weight, and when tensions exploded in the Middle East after the U.S. and Israel launched strikes on Iran, European governments largely kept their distance instead of rallying behind Washington. Trump believed this pressure campaign would force allies to buy more American weapons and fall back in line politically, but instead, it accelerated something European leaders had already been discussing quietly for years, which was the need for strategic independence from the United States. And now, the numbers behind that shift are becoming impossible to ignore. According to SIPRI, 64% of European NATO arms imports between 2020 and 2024 still came from the United States, which was the highest American share in nearly 2 decades. But the momentum underneath those figures is changing rapidly because European countries are increasingly directing new contracts towards suppliers outside the U.S. defense ecosystem. South Korea has emerged as the biggest surprise winner from this transition, with European NATO imports from South Korea rising by roughly 130% over the last 5 years. That growth is not symbolic either, because it involves some of the largest military contracts signed anywhere in the alliance since the war in Ukraine transformed Europe's defense posture. Poland alone has become one of the clearest examples of how quickly the old model is changing. Warsaw signed framework agreements worth more than $12 billion for South Korean K-2 Black Panther tanks, K-9 self-propelled howitzers, and F-A-50 fighter jets, while an additional $6 billion agreement for 180 more K-2 tanks is now close to completion through Hyundai Rotem. More than 200 K-9 howitzers are expected to be delivered by 2027, and Poland is already producing localized variants domestically, so that future manufacturing and maintenance can happen inside the country instead of relying entirely on foreign supply chains. That matters because Europe learned a brutal lesson after 2022 when countries discovered that even wealthy NATO members could wait years for deliveries from traditional Western defense manufacturers, while ammunition stockpiles were draining faster than expected. Spain, which Trump publicly criticized and even threatened over NATO spending disputes, also moved aggressively toward South Korean systems. Madrid signed a €4.55 billion agreement with Hanwha Aerospace for 280 tracked artillery systems based on the K-9 howitzer platform, followed by another €2.9 billion deal involving wheeled self-propelled artillery. Romania signed a separate billion-dollar agreement for K-9 howitzers and ammunition vehicles, while Hanwha began construction on a European assembly hub inside Romania in early 2026, so future production can happen closer to NATO territory. Estonia committed roughly €290 million for Chunmoo rocket launchers. Norway entered negotiations on a $1 billion Chunmoo package. Finland expanded its K-9 fleet to around 90 units, and France has reportedly explored South Korean K-239 Chunmoo systems as a possible alternative to the American HIMARS platform. What makes this trend so dangerous for American defense contractors is that it is not being driven by ideology or anti-American politics alone. It is being driven by speed, price, and flexibility. European governments discovered that ordering Leopard 2 tanks from Germany after 2022 often came with delivery timelines stretching 3 to 5 years into the future, while South Korean K2 tanks could arrive within 6 to 12 months. Korean systems are often estimated to cost between 20% and 40% less than comparable Western alternatives while still meeting NATO interoperability standards, which means governments under pressure to rearm quickly can save billions and receive equipment years earlier. That combination has made Seoul suddenly look like one of the most efficient defense suppliers in the world at exactly the moment Washington expected to dominate the market. South Korea clearly understands the opportunity in front of it. Seoul appointed a special envoy dedicated specifically to defense industry cooperation in Europe, while South Korean officials toured Norway, Romania, Sweden, and other NATO states promoting artillery systems, missile launchers, armored vehicles, and fighter aircraft. The European Union and South Korea also signed a formal security and defense partnership covering 15 areas of cooperation, deepening industrial ties at the exact moment relations between Washington and several European capitals became increasingly strained. South Korea's defense industry now openly talks about targeting more than $56 billion in European contracts over the coming years, which would have sounded almost unbelievable a decade ago when Europe's defense market was still overwhelmingly dominated by American and Western European firms. But the most symbolic moment in this entire transition may not involve tanks or artillery at all. It may involve the aircraft NATO uses to see the battlefield itself. For decades, NATO's airborne surveillance capability revolved around the Boeing E-3 Sentry AWACS fleet, a Cold War-era system built around American aircraft, American software, American supply chains, and American logistical control. The expected replacement was supposed to be the Boeing E-7 Wedgetail, another American-linked platform based on the Boeing 737 airframe, using a more advanced fixed radar array instead of the famous rotating radar dish carried by the E-3. In Washington, the assumption was simple and almost automatic because NATO had relied on American airborne command systems for generations, and few people seriously expected that to change. Then the political atmosphere shifted. Boeing's own problems continued piling up, and European governments started asking a question that would have sounded almost unthinkable years earlier, which was whether relying on American-controlled systems during an era of rising political volatility was still a safe long-term strategy. Reports in 2026 indicated NATO was seriously moving towards Saab's GlobalEye system instead of the Boeing option, marking the first time in alliance history that the core AWACS replacement effort could move away from an American platform. Saab's GlobalEye uses an active, electronically scanned array radar capable of monitoring air, sea, and ground targets simultaneously while operating with lower maintenance costs and a smaller logistical footprint than the older E-3 system. European officials also viewed it as faster to deploy, easier to sustain, and importantly, more politically independent. That final point matters far more than many people realize. European governments watched the United States threaten to cut Turkey off from F-35 access during the S-400 dispute, watched restrictions emerge around sensitive intelligence sharing during conflicts in the Middle East, and watched political tensions repeatedly spill into defense cooperation. Even countries that remain strongly pro-American started asking whether future military systems should depend entirely on software updates, supply chains, and operational permissions controlled from Washington. The GlobalEye discussion became symbolic because it represented something larger than a single aircraft purchase. It represented NATO members quietly asking whether Europe should control its own military nervous system instead of outsourcing critical dependencies abroad. At the same time, the European Union itself started building policies designed specifically to redirect defense money inward toward European industry. The EU's massive Rearm Europe strategy aims to mobilize hundreds of billions of euros in defense investment over the next several years, while the SAFE instrument, officially valued at 150 billion euros, was created to finance joint procurement and industrial expansion inside Europe. Under SAFE, governments seeking funding are heavily encouraged to purchase systems tied to the European defense industrial base, and the structure strongly limits dependence on suppliers outside the EU framework. Reuters reported that the program includes a Buy European mechanism requiring at least 65% of project value to originate from companies inside the EU, EEA countries, or Ukraine, while limiting outside components to roughly 35%. Financial Times reporting earlier indicated that American contractors risk exclusion from major portions of the program unless broader defense agreements are negotiated. And this is where the situation becomes politically explosive for Washington, because Trump's pressure campaign may have accelerated exactly the industrial separation American defense companies feared most. Europe is not reducing military spending. In fact, military budgets across NATO are rising dramatically. Germany alone approved enormous increases after years of underinvestment. Poland is now spending one of the highest percentages of GDP on defense anywhere in NATO, and EU-wide military spending has surged by roughly 30% over the last 3 years. The money is there, the demand is there, but more of that spending is increasingly being directed toward European or non-American suppliers instead of flowing automatically into the U.S. defense industry. Nowhere is this conflict more politically sensitive than in Canada, where the future of the F-35 purchase has quietly evolved into something much bigger than a fighter jet contract. In January 2023, Canada committed to purchasing 88 F-35A fighters from Lockheed Martin to replace the aging CF-18 fleet, with the deal initially valued around 19 billion Canadian dollars and total long-term life cycle costs later estimated above $27 billion before additional revisions pushed the projected numbers even higher. The first 16 aircraft remain under contract, with deliveries expected to begin at the end of 2026. But the remaining jets became the center of a growing political and strategic debate after Trump returned to office and launched new tariff pressure on Canadian industries. In March 2025, Prime Minister Mark Carney ordered a formal review of the full 88 aircraft purchase just weeks after trade tensions escalated again between Ottawa and Washington. That review has continued for more than a year without a final decision, and the delay itself tells you exactly what is happening behind the scenes. Canada understands that the remaining 72 F-35s represent leverage because every additional aircraft means billions of dollars flowing toward Lockheed Martin and hundreds of American suppliers during a period when the United States is simultaneously applying pressure through tariffs on Canadian steel, aluminum, automobiles, and trade policy negotiations. Saab immediately recognized the opening and moved aggressively. CEO Mikael Johansson described discussions with Ottawa as quite intensive, while Saab promoted the Gripen E as a fighter that could be assembled, maintained, and partially controlled inside Canada itself. Saab proposed building the aircraft using a model similar to the one used in Brazil, where locally assembled Gripen E fighters were unveiled in 2026, and the company promised thousands of domestic jobs tied directly to Canadian industry. Saab also floated the idea of building the GlobalEye platform in Canada and establishing sovereign data infrastructure in Montreal, so Canadian military data would remain under Canadian control rather than routing through American systems. That proposal struck directly at one of the most controversial aspects of the F-35 program. The F-35 is technologically impressive, but it is also deeply dependent on American-controlled software architecture, maintenance systems, and supply chains. Software updates require American approval, major sustainment flows through centralized logistics networks tied to the United States, and operational support remains linked to American infrastructure. Meanwhile, the U.S. Government Accountability Office has repeatedly warned about sustainment problems surrounding the F-35, including reports showing mission-capable rates hovering around 50% for parts of the fleet, while the massive Block 4 modernization effort faced years of delays beyond its original 2020 target. Carney's government now finds itself balancing military requirements, domestic industry concerns, and trade negotiations simultaneously. Ottawa has reportedly continued making payments tied to long lead components for additional aircraft so Canada can maintain its production queue position without fully committing to all remaining jets. That allows Canada to keep options open while USMCA negotiations continue in the background. Those negotiations matter enormously because the United States is pushing for major revisions to the trade agreement, while Canada assembled a powerful advisory council including executives from Bank of Montreal, TC Energy, CN Rail, and former conservative leaders to prepare for what could become one of the most consequential economic negotiations in years. And that is why the F-35 suddenly stopped looking like just a fighter jet and started looking more like diplomatic leverage. If Canada commits immediately to all remaining aircraft while trade tensions remain unresolved, Ottawa loses one of the strongest bargaining chips it still possesses. By delaying, Canada preserves flexibility. If relations improve, the purchase can move forward gradually. If tensions worsen, Canada could reduce the order order, adopt a mixed fleet strategy involving Gripens, or redirect billions toward domestic and European-linked aerospace partnerships instead. That possibility alone would have been almost unimaginable a decade ago because the F-35 program was designed partly around the assumption that allied countries would remain tied to the American defense ecosystem for generations. And this is where I want to hear from you, because there are strong arguments on both sides of this debate. Some people believe Europe becoming more independent militarily would actually strengthen NATO long-term by reducing pressure on the United States, while others think breaking away from American systems could weaken coordination and split the alliance during future crises. So, if Canada eventually reduces its F-35 order, or if NATO officially locks in Saab's GlobalEye instead of Boeing, do you think this is Europe finally becoming strategically mature, or is it the beginning of a deeper fracture inside the Western alliance? Let me know in the comments, and make sure you subscribe and stick around because there is a lot more happening.